Hello, I'm Siraj Khan, lecturer in English Cast. Welcome to my subject, Literary Criticism 2. Our course code is English 332, and we are talking about T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality in poetry, which is our lecture number 14. Eliot was almost as renowned a literary critic as he was a poet. From 1916 through 1921, he contributed approximately 100 reviews and articles to various periodicals. This early criticism was produced at night under the pressure of supplementing his meager salary. First as a teacher, then as a bank clerk, in not, as is sometimes suggested, under the compulsion to rewrite literary history, a product of his critical intelligence and superb training in philosophy and literature. His essays, however hastily written and for whatever motive, had an immediate impact. His ideas quickly solidified into doctrine and became, with the early essays of I.A. Richards, the basis of the new criticism, one of the most influential schools of literary study in the 20th century. Through half a century of critical writing, Eliot's concerns remained more or less constant. His position regarding those concerns, however, was frequently refined, revised, or occasionally reversed. Beginning in the late 1920s, Eliot's literary criticism was supplemented by religious and social criticism. In these writings, such as The Idea of a Christian Society, 1939, he can be seen as a deeply involved and thoughtful Christian poet in the process of making sense of the war between the two world wars. These writings, sympathetically read, suggest the dilemma of the serious observer of Western culture in the 1930s, and rightly understood, they complement his poetry, plays, and literary journalism. The outlines are poet's biography, impersonal theory, two-folded theory, addressing emotions and feelings, tradition and individual talent, examples in conclusion. T.S. Eliot, in full, Thomas Stearns Eliot, born September 26, 1888, St. Louis, Missouri, U.S., died in January 4, 1965, London, England. American English poet, playwright, literary critic, and editor, a leader of the modernist movement in poetry in such works as The Waste Land, 1922, and Four Quartets, 1943. Eliot exercised a strong influence on Anglo-American culture from the 1920s until late in the century. His experiments in diction, style, versification revitalized English poetry, and in a series of critical essays, he shattered old orthodoxies and erected new ones. The publication of Four Quartets led to his recognition as the greatest living English poet and man of letters, and in 1948 he was awarded both the Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Both scholar languages, and philosophy. In the theory of objective criticism, he presented. The Wasteland, the most important work, the love song of Jal Profrock, tradition and individual observation. His impersonal theory continual surrender of himself. Eliot says that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion. But an escape from emotions. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know that it means to want to escape from these things. Eliot criticizes the romantic poets for being engrossed in subjectivity in their poems. As a matter of fact, Eliot could not escape being completely impersonal in his poetry, though he emphasizes the importance of impersonality in poetry. Elman, 1987, argues that T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound advocate impersonality, but they often smuggle their personality back into their poetics. He adds that Eliot insists that poetry originates in personal emotion and that the poet's subjectivity pervades the text. The personality of the artist is not important. The important thing is his sense of tradition. A good poem is a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. He must forget his personal joys and sorrows, and he observed in acquiring a sense of tradition and expressing it in his poetry. Thus, the poets personality is merely a medium having the same significance as a catalytic agent or a receptacle in which chemical reactions take place. That is why Eliot holds that honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. The notion of the several Eliots includes the argument that he is of two minds about impersonality in art. In tradition and the individual talent and other early essays, he argues that the greatest art is impersonal. In the same essays, sometimes in the same sentence, he maintains that the greatest art is personal. Poetry is not the expression of personality but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality know what it means to want to escape. The perception that Eliot's concept of impersonality seemed contradictory began early, is which reviews of the Sacred Wood 1920 in March 1921, for example, Conrad Aiken outlined the ostensible contradiction between the statements about impersonality in tradition and the individual talent, and those in Messenger Align 1921. The charge of inconsistency was not mitigated by Eliot's comments on the wasteland, which he variously described as impersonal and as the belief of a personal holy insignificance grows against life. What is impersonality? It's a twofold theory that the relation of the poet to the past. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. The poet must believes his own personality, his own feeling and experiences from the subject of poetry. The relation of the poem to its author. First, the relation of the poet to the past, and second, the relation of the poem to its author. The poet is never dead, it lives in the present. No poet or no artist has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. The poetry will be timeless, and there is significance between poetry, poet, and poetry. Uses of impersonality of T.S. Eliot's poetry. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Thus, Eliot does not deny personality or emotion to the poet, only he must depersonalize his emotions. There should be an extinction of his personality. This impersonality can be achieved only when poet surrenders himself completely to the work that is to be done. And the poet can know what is to be done only if he acquires a sense of tradition, the historic sense which makes him conscious not only of the present but also of the present moment of the past, not only of what is dead but of what is already living. Poet and poetry are different entities. As he wrote in the introduction to the 1928 edition of the Sacred Word, we can only say that a poem in some case has its own life, that it parts from something quite different, from a body of neatly covered biographical data, that the feeling or emotion or vision in the mind of the poet. The central point of T.S. Eliot's impersonal theory of poetry is that the poet and the poetry are two separate things. The impersonal conception of poetry focuses attention not upon the poet but upon the poetry. The impersonal conception of poetry focuses attention not upon the poet but upon the poetry. It thus emphasizes the art object. As such, Eliot believes that relationship is complex because the work of art is to be regarded as an organism alive with a life of its own. Eliot uses addressing how he addresses the impersonality in his poetry. Eliot uses the first person singular pronoun in most of his poems. For instance, Eliot's The Wasteland encompasses the first person singular pronouns I, me, my enormously, except the fourth section of the poem, Death by Water, which does not involve any of the first person pronouns. In another poem, in Ash Wednesday, the first person singular pronouns are present from the opening lines, but the speaker in Eliot's Ash Wednesday refers to the poet himself indirectly at the poem reflects his religious vision of life in God, but Eliot utilizes the persona as a mask to avoid self-expression. In Eliot's The Hollow Men, the first person singular pronouns are used 3 times. Similarly, in Eliot's early poetry collections, Prologue and Other Observations and Ariel poems, the first person singular pronouns are found in many poems. Exploring impersonality in Eliot's poetry through tracking the use of the first person singular pronouns is not highly reliable because the poet may use a technique of a persona as the speaker in the poem. In Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Eliot 1957 says that the first voice is the voice of the poet, taking to himself to nobody, talking to himself or to nobody. The second is the voice of the poet addressing an audience, whether large or small. The third is the voice of the poet when he attempts to create a dramatic character speaking in verse, when he is saying not what he would say in his own persona, but only what he can say within the limits of one imaginary character addressing another imaginary character. Some examples. The Wasteland begins with a description of a cruel spring, cruel to disturb, dull, dry land content to sleep, to die. Life and surely personality are the moisture missing in this wasteland. But why? Then, am I haunted from the first line with personality? There are several reasons, but one of them is that the base of personal pronouns awakens a sense of personal engagement. First, the reader seems to be involved in you, in us, and we. The reader needs not involve himself. The personal pronouns clearly refer to others instead. It doesn't matter the sense of participation persists besides a personal aside, like Connie in Under the Shadow of This Red Rock. This line justifies the reader in his presumption. More example we can take from his other poems, like For Quartets partakes of this personality. The quartets are No more abstract statement than either of the poems above. Still, from the very first moment of each involves the reader in you or we. But Burnt issues another direct invitation. Shall we fall? East Cocker begins in the poet personal's voice, persona's voice. In my beginning is my end, and involves a particular you from line 14. Is here we have got, if you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take from the place you would be likely to come from. And it's from Little Getting. Another is across the open field, leaving the deep land, shuttered with branches, dark in the afternoon, where you lean against a bank while a van passes. The first section of the dry salvages contains the most formal, impersonal introduction of all the quartets. But it does speak directly. I do not know much about gods, but I think the poet and reader are involved together with all mankind in us and our. The first movement of Little Getting offers a typical personal identification, as if you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take from the place you would be likely to come from. That's all. Thank you and good luck.